All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's the same day. It is our CFB Talk 53. My name is Bob Kyrie, and we're going to have another evening of discussing college football. I'm going to be joined by my regular co hosts, JD and Sirius. We're going to have a special guest tonight. From the Wall Street Journal, we're going to be joined by Laine Higgins, who covers college sports for Pillar of Journalistic Excellence. So we're going to go ahead and get everyone up here. Looks like I got Sirius. Looks like Laine's in the audience. So we're gonna get this going pretty quick. Let's see. And there's JD. Excellent. All right, Laine. Just wanted to check and make sure you got that and you're up. It looks like you are.
Yes, I think I'm all set. Can you hear me?
Sure can. All right,
Fabulous.
great. So again, for those of you joining us, this is RCFB Talk 53. My name's Bob Kyrie. Got JD and Sirius here as well. You may have joined us earlier today when we were talking to TCU's AD, but we're going to change gears. We're going to talk more general college football rather than, the Horned Frogs are awesome, but let's talk about some more sports. So, Laine, there's a lot of questions I want to ask you because you cover a lot of topics, everything from playoff expansion to conference realignment, athlete status, and whether or not, that development and whether or not they're going to be held as employees or not. But one thing I
hmm
thought was interesting, I know you have a degree in international relations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
I
Yeah.
respect that because I
So
do too. So I feel like, yeah, here
great.
we are both talking about sports.
Yes, no, thank you. It's funny, where I went to undergrad, there was not a journalism school, and I went in dead set that I was going to be a diplomat after college. So that's why I majored in international relations. And I sort of, took whatever sports classes I could whenever. And if there was ever a chance to write an essay about, international soccer, I would. But yeah, my background is very different from the day to day of college football.
I feel that. No, I thought I would go and become a diplomat later myself, and then here we are right now. Yeah, but have you ever been tempted to ask like how would like Hans Morgenthau advise the approach of
Oh
conference
gosh.
relations?
I mean, I don't know if I could do a Blue Book exam on like constructivism versus realism versus neoliberalism, but there was probably one point in my life when I could have answered that in a very
Yeah, we're going
scholarly
really
way.
deep into an audience of like five maybe on
Yeah.
the planet. Well, okay, I'm gonna share this story only because I'll never get a chance to. I had a professor back in the day who was trying to
hmm
explain it because I went to USC, a football heavy
hmm
school. And he's like, the realist approach to the USC UCLA game would be USC going and obliterating the Bruins and running up the score and never letting off the gas pedal and just establishing power while
hmm
at the time we called it I forgot what we even called it before it was neoliberalism was like we'll all get together, they'll get together in the middle of the field and come up with a discussion on how to have an equal tie, and there'll be lots of discussions
hmm
between the players, and then the radical version of it will have the players realizing that they're being exploited and charge into the alumni stand under a united front of tearing down the system. So I
Yeah,
always
sounds
that
right.
always But anyways, we got a little bit distracted there. So you answered my next question, which is how you ended up in sports reporting. But what kind of background did you have in that? And you swam, didn't you, in college?
Yes. Yeah, so I was Division 1 athlete, and I was a walk-on, so I didn't necessarily have the same pressure to perform as a lot of my other teammates did, and that allowed me to pursue my other passion, which was writing. And I worked for the school newspaper. I went to UPenn, so it was called the Daily Pennsylvanian, and we had a joke that the sports section, we called ourselves Depostum, which stood for the Daily Pennsylvanian's only section that matters, which was, we were quite full of ourselves with that. But I had joined that initially because I thought it might be a good way to meet other athletes and make friends. And when you're interviewing the goalie, I think it was my first story. I was interviewing the goalie of the soccer team, and they had just lost to Georgetown, which was, I think, then like a top 3 school in soccer. It's like really, really bad loss. And you're talking to them, asking, how does it feel to lose? Like, what was that like? You're like, okay, I'm not really going to be making friends through this. But I really liked, the energy of going to games. I grew up a huge sports fan, watching football, and I used to think this was normal, but I've since learned it's not. But I used to always read, Sports Illustrated cover to cover and the sports section of the Wall Street Journal just because I liked that they were a little bit different as a teenager. And there I'd be on the sidelines of our high school football team explaining to my friends what a fumble was. So I was a bit of an outlier in that way. And I had a mentor push me towards applying to do an internship in sports journalism over the summer after my freshman year, because at that point I was planning on just going home and being a lifeguard. And somehow it worked out. And from that experience, I totally fell in love and just kind of, you know, head first, no pun intended there, into sports writing.
So, as I recall, you actually have some football in the family. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my dad played at the University of Michigan. So I like to joke that we didn't have much choice in what school we were going to be a fan of in college football, because I did not grow up in Michigan, but yeah, we they were always on.
Yeah.
So, speaking of the whole international relations, that actually might come in handy considering the fact what's happened this summer and the shift that we see with college football towards what looks to be a big two, a power two,
Hmm.
and then literally everyone else. So you were at Big Ten and SEC Media Days this year, right?
Yes, that's correct.
What was the vibe there? Could you see some similarities from what you were seeing or hearing between those two conferences now that they've kind of set themselves apart from the pack?
I mean, the SEC kind of seemed unbothered by this latest wave of realignment. They're kind of like, been there, done that. That's so summer 2021, in the sense that, they can kind of sit back and not worry too much about what all is happening, because they're pretty much set. And, both their TV deal being done and knowing that they're going to have two great brands in Texas and Oklahoma coming over. And at the Big Ten, there was a lot more questions about, are you done expanding? Like, where is this going next? Because, I think the move kind of caught some off guard. I don't know if anyone really believed the alliance was that firm of a thing, but this very clearly violated it by adding, USC and UCLA to the Big Ten. And I think it was sort of a perception shift around Kevin Warren. For a long time, the narrative in college sports has been that SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey is kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes, all powerful, and that he sits on the transformation committee. He, was on that small group within the playoff management committee that suggested, different expansion models there, and also just, commissioner of the league that has had many of the last national champions in football. And there wasn't really that same sense around Kevin Warren. And I think that perception of him is starting to change because, he was new. He had a trial by fire by having his first year coincide with a pandemic. And I really do think that there's sort of this sense of, oh, maybe this guy knows what he's doing a little more than we think. And maybe he's able to pull some strings in the same way that Sankey is. And I could kind of sense that as the predominant vibe within the Big Ten. But, a lot of the coaches that were there and speaking, they're like, this is great, whatever it brings, however many people we get, like, we're pretty confident in where we're going. I was not at ACC, Big 12, or Pac 12 media days, but from what I understand, there was a little bit more tension and anxiety, perhaps. So I think that, as you said, it's telling. It's kind of like, to use a international relations metaphor, a bipolar world that we're moving towards.
You mentioned the reputation of Kevin Warren really changing after this newest wave of realignment. I know that Bob Bowlesby, when he lost Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, a lot of people thought, oh man, Bob's asleep at the wheel. What kind of perception do we see right now with the Pac-12 commissioner, given, USC and UCLA seeming almost out of nowhere joining the Big Ten? What's that national perception right now for him going forward?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between the perception of Bowlesby in the aftermath of Texas and Oklahoma leaving and George Kliavkoff right now is that you have such a different tenure and experience in the job, and that Bob Bowlesby had been in the job for over a decade. That's his league. I mean, he's very much synonymous with it, whereas, George is new to college sports, and I don't think anyone necessarily faults him. I think there had been rumblings for a while that USC and UCLA were maybe unhappy, and that, who knows, maybe if this had happened a year later, once the Pac-12 was further along into its discussions with some of its TV partners, because, its deal doesn't come up till 2024, it's still a little bit early to be negotiating. It's possible that if that had a shorter time horizon, there would have been, maybe some I don't want to say favors, but, maybe some concessions given of, that's something that the Big 12 explored with Longhorn Network, was just having sort of unequal revenue sharing. And if these LA schools are really going to be mentioning, hey, we have the biggest market, we bring in the most eyeballs and the most money, we'd like to be compensated as such, it's possible that maybe the Pac-12 would have moved that way. But George really wasn't given a chance to offer any bargaining chips. And, I think it's hard to be in an environment where you can't trust anyone. And I think that that's not, this is just my personal speculation, but I don't think he expected that. I don't think he expected any sort of move. You remember your reaction when you first saw, John Wilner's tweet about USC and UCLA to the Big Ten. It was just like, eye roll. Okay, yeah, right. And then you're like, wait a second. John Wilner knows everything about the Pac-12. Like, I'm sure there's truth to this. And it was just shock. So I don't know. I don't see the perception of George being quite the same and like being aloof and checked out as maybe some were saying about Bob in the aftermath last summer.
Speaking of this kind of, rhetoric that we're seeing, we've seen a lot of that from the commissioners. Yormark saying the Big 12 is open for business, and then
Yeah.
Klyovkov saying, I haven't decided if we're going to go shopping there or not.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone's anticipating, a knife fight between these conferences for survival, but which conference, at least at this point, seems to have a stronger position?
If we're just talking about television prospects and flexibility, I think it is the Pac-12 because, two things. One, this is something that's been pointed out by several people, but if you are really looking at something that makes them unique, it's that they have games on at 10:30 p.m. Eastern, and they will pretty much always have that, whereas no team in the ACC or Big 12, they're not going to have a kickoff that late ever. So that's a unique window for, broadcasters that they would be looking at that the other conferences, save now the Big Ten, would not be able to, provide. So I think that that's one advantage. Another is that their grant of rights, which it's interesting. The three conferences, the major conferences that have grant of rights are the ACC, Big 12, and Pac-12. And the Pac-12's, I think, expires first because theirs is 24, the Big 12 is 25, and the ACC's isn't until 2036. So because of that, it allows movement either out or to add members. You can add members whenever, but you can move around and be a little bit more flexible at a sooner date than you could if you're in the ACC. And, being locked up till 2036, that was a decision that was made because, there was a lot of fear that another charter member like Maryland was going to bolt. And at the time, stability looked good, but it's now really hamstringing that conference because, yeah, there maybe are some schools that would be itching to leave, but there's a huge legal and possible financial penalty and just a lot of uncertainty to doing that. And, yes, you're concentrated geographically in one area, and that's great for your conference, and there's other rivals in the area. But again, like, if college football is moving towards these truly national brands, I think that, yeah, there's just more competition in the Eastern United States for TV times. And I think that really does, it's kind of a dark horse thing that's working in the Pac-12's favor.
We know that the Big 12 has already been able to shore up their conference with some new additions. The Pac-12, as you mentioned, has that unique marketing role with those late night games. Is the ACC actually in a bit of danger here? New commissioner with Jim Phillips, relatively new, and that extremely long period before their contract comes back up for negotiation unless something changes. Because we've heard some rumblings about schools that either getting courted or getting a little bit antsy. Are they in kind of a weak position here where their hands are a little bit tied?
I certainly think so. I imagine that every lawyer on the Eastern Seaboard that has a relationship with one of those schools has been looking into these grant of rights. And, the fact that Texas and Oklahoma have not tried to bolt for the SEC, which is offering so much more money before theirs ends in 2025, I think is pretty telling. And that, these aren't long documents, but there's so much uncertainty about the jurisdiction of where a possible suit would happen and, whether you're successful. And if you're not, that's a lot of legal fees you've wasted, that it kind of makes it a really scary process because the worst case scenario is you challenge it, you try to leave and you lose and you forego the right to televise your games through 2036. And that's not, that's a very steep penalty plus whatever exit fee there is associated. And I do think that I mean, in some ways it creates an incentive for the ACC to be creative in other ways about driving up revenue, but they kind of were behind with ACC Network on a relative scale. And now I think this current TV contract they have that, is more recent is definitely going to, I think it's totally fair to say that's a weakness.
One thing we've been, hearing about is the Pac-12 media rights negotiations might go far into the season. Is that going to be, how does that appear strategically for the conference? Is that wise to let it go that far, or should they have tried to wrap that up faster?
I mean, I think everyone would probably like the certainty of knowing how much money is on the table. And obviously, they had this 30-day window, exclusive negotiating window with ESPN, and that's wrapping up, I believe, this week. And, yes, it's great if you can get everything buttoned up by then, but George had alluded to the fact that there was maybe going to be some, non-conventional partners, like some streaming partners maybe that would be involved in media rights and just pursuing really creative ways. So I think that is an attempt, reading between the lines, to have more ways to diversify revenue and be a little more creative in that, and boost it aside from just whatever your linear TV partner is going to be. And I think that the reason why the schools are being patient and, not trying to bolt yet is they want more information on the table, because they want to know how much the Pac-12 is going to actually be able to give them before they think about, what's on the flip side of that, of like, what is the exit fee if we do try to leave? How much money would we be getting elsewhere? And I also think that kind of looming in the background, we've heard lots of numbers thrown out there about the Big Ten's possible new contract. And I think once that is finalized, that will also be a sort of pushing factor towards action or decision on behalf of these Pac-12 schools, because then it's a little more concrete. And, granted, if it's a $1.5 billion a year contract, that's not equally divided amongst 16 schools. There is some overhead. It's a little bit less than that, but then it does give you a more concrete ballpark number of where things are headed compared to what you have. But I think until those negotiations are done, you're going to see a little bit more hesitation and reluctance to move.
In what ways can we expect a Big Ten deal to influence not just the Pac-12 deal, but other downstream deals for other conferences? I know that there's been the negotiation of it might go to Amazon Prime, it might go to Hulu, it might go to a linear cable network. The money is obviously a clear one, but what are some of the ways that this contract might affect other contracts in ways that we might not expect?
Right. So if you think about it, there's only so many hours that Fox and ESPN can broadcast. So obviously, the more they're gobbling up of some of these conferences, the more that there's going to be something like a CBS or, another entity like an Amazon, as you said, that could potentially buy up some of these rights. And I think there has been, even though we're starting to see that a little bit with MLB and NFL, with, the Thursday night broadcast, there's starting to be a little bit more openness to doing that. But I think people are still really skeptical, just because live sports is the one last vestige of TV that really, really drives viewership in a way that, nothing else does. Like, if you look at the top broadcasts, granted, this is the NFL, but, the most watched broadcasts in any given week, like, the majority of them in the top 10 are NFL games. So I think there's sort of this hesitation of moving to another platform when you know that the current model is still working really dang well. So I don't totally know how this will affect the downstream stuff, but I imagine that there's going to be, maybe for some of these smaller conferences, they're going to have to be a little bit more creative with how they, find a media partner, just because, the other more, traditional or established ones are already going pretty all in on other places.
You mentioned CBS. Were you a little bit surprised that, they had a really good deal with the whole SEC on CBS package that they had been doing, and general consensus was that they had it at a very far below market rate price?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Were you surprised that they didn't take any of that and use it to spend on the negotiations when ESPN stole it away from them?
I mean, I wasn't party to those discussions. I wasn't in the room, but it does make you wonder if they just weren't willing to go that high. Like, if they just didn't, I don't know what the bottom line of CBS, independent of their, of that one package is, but you look at NBC and how they're recently like winding down the Olympic channel and stuff, they're kind of backing off of some of their more specialized content. It's possible that CBS is kind of in the same situation where maybe the other financial picture is just that it doesn't make sense for them to go all in on it. Whereas if you have, a network like ESPN that has such wall-to-wall sports programming, not only can you play these games, but you can promote it in a way that's a little bit more, I hate myself for using this word, but synergistic. And that,
I was thinking the same thing. It's okay.
Good. But no, just in the sense that you can maybe pay an incredibly high price, but you also kind of get free advertising when it's on a platform like ESPN that you might not get to the same extent in something like CBS that has so much other content that's non-sports.
Right. Your target demo is already tuned in for the week.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Laine, with all this talk of massive TV contracts and more money coming into the sport itself, I'm a little bit curious. Do you think this changes at all the debate about athletes as employees? And is there going to be any kind of progress because of these dollar signs that are being thrown out?
I think the bigger thing, obviously, when there's all these dollar signs, that enrages some people. And I think that some people are like, why can't that go to athletes? But I think the bigger shift that you're maybe going to see galvanizing this is when you see someone like, Brian Kelly making $10 million a year at LSU, and, all of these crazy contracts in the last year, Jimbo Fisher, Nick Saban got an extension, Lincoln Riley, which we don't know the details of, but is quite large. And, Kirby just got extended at Georgia. That all of these coaches and so many of their coordinators and assistants now are making 7 figures, sometimes 8 figures, which is ludicrous. And if you think the highest paid public employee is the football coach by like a large margin. And I think that makes a little bit more of an awkward dynamic because it's more concentrated on the field in a way that you can put a face to it, in the way that, it's hard to picture, okay, what does it really mean for a conference to get 1.5 or 1 billion a year from TV revenue? And I think a bigger factor in all of this also is just that there's slowly been this chipping away at the way it always was and the old infrastructure in college sports, in that you have these cost of attendance payments and you have these academic stipends that are direct results of the Alston agreement, and you have NIL. So there, it's kind of normalized the concept of athletes making some money, and I think that sort of is maybe kind of fertilizing the ground for something more dramatic to happen. And obviously there are, current legal and other challenges, both in Congress, before the NLRB, and before the court system about, pushing for a minimum wage or some sort of employee status that would entitle these athletes to maybe more benefits, and definitely a salary of some sort. And, there's obviously going to be a lot more money flowing into college sports, but the whole business model of it right now is a break-even industry. Like, they're not really saving money for a rainy day. These athletic departments are spending as much, if not more, than they bring in any given year. And, I think part of the reason why there is that model is that it makes it easier to justify not having a salary if you don't have any surplus. But, these things are choices. Like, if you decide that you're going to be able to, if there is a rule change and you decide that you're going to be able to recruit better athletes by offering them a salary than by adding an Xbox to all of their lockers and really offering, a tricked out weight room or things like that, like maybe that's the calculus that there is. Like, these things are priorities in how you are spending. And I think that you might see shifts in that if there is a rule change. Granted, we are not there yet. I don't know how exactly we might get there, but there has been a lot more athlete agitation towards, greater empowerment in that regard.
Laine, are we going to see a move towards revenue sharing with schools and employment protections, at least from the athletes? I know that's something that folks like Ramoji Huma, who's the executive director of the National College Player Association, have been pushing for.
Yeah, I think something that's actually kind of surprising to many is that what's more pressing and, immediate, visceral to a lot of these athletes is not necessarily the revenue sharing, but it's having, access to independent healthcare where you can get a second opinion that's not going to be a doctor that's maybe influenced by your coach that's pushing you to get it back on the field, or having greater resources around mental health and, having some say in practice times or things like that. I think that has a much greater impact on the experience than the revenue sharing would be, because that still seems so complicated and nebulous. Like, how does that, how do you do it? Is it just only in football and basketball or sports that make money, or because of Title IX, is it everything? And like, do you prorate it based on how much playing time you have? Like, there are so many questions around that it feels, I think, less tangible to many of these athletes, whereas a lot of them have dealt with injury, and a lot of them have a teammate that has maybe had an experience firsthand where they can point to someone that had to medically retire because of having too many concussions or what have you, or, tearing their ACL. And I think that is something that really, really does shape the college experience for a lot of these athletes, just given how much they're pushing their bodies. And I think that I would not be surprised if there's more of collective bargaining is maybe not the right term because there's not a union, but more of an advocacy and more of a push for that. You're definitely seeing it in the mental health space. There's been a lot of efforts around that, especially during the pandemic and, kind of its ongoing ramifications for athletes. But I think that is probably the next direction that things would go more than anything.
From what you're reporting, it seems, because I know this is something you're working on quite a bit and have worked on before, are a lot of the athletes that you're talking to that tend to want to look at those factors like healthcare protection, is it equally across the board among, revenue and non-revenue sports, or is this a push from the larger number of athletes who tend to be in non-revenue sports in some of those major athletic departments?
It's probably a little bit of the latter, just in the sense that I think those athletes see themselves as having less to gain if there is revenue sharing, because, they're not athletes that know that they're bringing in money for their schools. That said, I do think that in a sport like football, where it is so punishing and taxing on your body, that there is still a huge push for that. And, in this most recent movement that we saw that ultimately kind of fizzled out at Penn State, from conversations with the people involved, one of the reasons why Sean Clifford was so invested and interested in trying to push for athletes' rights was because he was really moved by his friend Journey Brown, who had to medically retire from football because of, injuries he sustained during his playing career and, a subsequent condition that they discovered. And I think that, yes, all student athletes would probably want a little more money. Who doesn't want to be able to buy more pizza when you're in college and, beer and other substances? But, I think it's more, there's a quality of life aspect to this that I think is more pressing to a lot of athletes. And I don't know, they often get painted as like, these really greedy, they just want money type kids, but like that is really not the vibe on a lot of these campuses. And even among football, like they care about their sport, they want to be able to do it to the best of their ability, but like they also want to be humans that have balance in their life. And we used to joke in college, you can either have a social life, good grades, or be good at your sport. Pick two, and you can't have all three. And I think that that's a reality that athletes are kind of pushing up against and saying, maybe we want a little bit more balance in that.
Can you give us a little bit more insight into kind of what happened at Penn State? Because it seemed like there was kind of a big announcement, everybody got a little excited, and then there was some backtracking that happened really quickly afterwards.
Yeah, my understanding is that, there were some conversations and between Sean Clifford and several activists, and college athlete advocates, and just he's trying to learn and educate him on space. He's 24. He's a very old college football player. He's smart. He's been around it, and he has his own NIL agency. So it makes sense that he was curious. And, he connected with Jason Stahl, who is the founder of a kind of nascent organization called the College Football Players Association. That's not actually a union or a players association. It's kind of this loose, like kind of a networking thing, but also they're trying to push for changes to college athletes. Like it's kind of nebulous. And he came out to campus, he met with several people on the team, and then he was snuck into a meeting, which I think is kind of telling in that like everyone involved there knew that they were maybe doing something that was like not quite right, and that maybe there should have been more transparency and there wasn't. However, apparently a strength and conditioning coach walked into the meeting at the end of this big presentation by Jason. And at that point, it gets run up the flagpole. There's various entities at Penn State and then the Big Ten that hear about it. And then there's more conversations, and it's a little unclear. There's a little bit of he said, she said in this part, but it sounds like the people at the College Football Playoff Association, College Football Players Association, were really pushing for some big dramatic announcement at Big Ten Media Days. And Sean was kind of like, I don't know if that's what this is for. I don't know if this is the right vibe. And I think he kind of got cold feet in terms of how everything was happening, not necessarily the what and the cause. And he, distances himself and ended his relationship with the CFBPA. And, and I think at some point there was a conversation where, Kevin Warren, the Big Ten commissioner, had connected with Jason, and Jason was hoping to form a Penn State chapter of the CFBPA, which they were insisting is not a union, but again, it sounds a heck of a lot like a union, so it's a little bit fuzzy there. And obviously that didn't end up happening ever because this sort of dissolved, ties soured. But in any case, there was a miscommunication about whether he should come to media days, but like there's no one. Media days is not just a hobnobbing like conference for anyone in the industry. It's really just reporters and players and coaches. So there's not really a role for someone like that to be there if they're not media. So I don't know. It kind of died down. I don't think it's happening, but I think the whole premise of, athletes wanting a larger voice was something that was definitely heard and acknowledged by the, administration at Penn State and at the Big Ten. And, they're obviously moving forward and trying to have open discussions. But, the players that were there at Big Ten Media Days were milling around, chatting with Kevin whenever he was on the field. And I think that, there is a little bit more open communication than perhaps there had been, but it's really unclear what's happening with that. It doesn't seem like much, but it's also it's very fuzzy. And right now, with so much he said, she said going on between the parties that are involved, it's kind of hard to know what exactly did happen, put it that way. But I think the upshot is that there's not going to be a union at Penn State anytime soon.
That is fascinating background on what happened. Here at Reddit CFB, we're very much pro player. It's always great to see what so many of these athletes are doing with their opportunities in terms of like NIL and giving back to the community, using their voice and their platform. So hearing what Sean Clifford is trying to, at least bring awareness to, if not actually, organize. But in terms of what he's doing with his NIL, we've seen some things where QBs have made deals and, the rewards actually go to their offensive linemen, that kind of thing. Do you think we'll see more star athletes using their platforms in that way to help out their teammates, if that's going to be a growing trend as this develops?
It wouldn't surprise me if there's an element of that, just because if you have the means and, the brand power to hire an agent and some sort of person that's helping you navigate it, I totally can see how in the locker room you'd be providing informal advice to some of your buddies that maybe don't have the same opportunities as you if they're trying to get into the NIL space. So it wouldn't surprise me if, there's more of that. Maybe not in the same formal capacity that is, like what Sean's doing with his own, it's not a collective, but his own sort of organization. But, I think that there definitely are a lot of questions that still remain, and even a lot of star players that are like, it's just too much to add to my plate. Like, I'm just going to let the main thing be football and focus on that and not worry about it. So I think even though everyone is always, championing, not everyone, but lots of people have championed NIL and said it's great for these athletes to do, like, they don't exactly have a lot of free time to just go market themselves, even with these platforms like Influencer and Open Doors. So I think it's being utilized less than it could be, and it maybe would take, a unique athlete on the team like a Sean Clifford who is super invested in it and recognizes how, beneficial it could be to really galvanize that amongst other players on the team. But, it's kind of still, I guess I understand why athletes aren't doing it more, because I think they have the fear of God in them that the NCAA is going to find a violation and come down and like vacate victories like they've done in so many ways for other, punishments. And they're hesitant. And, maybe the $20 that they would get from endorsing the campus pizza place is not worth it. I don't know. So I would not be surprised if there's more of it, but I think NIL is going to take a few more years to really mature, because it's still so confusing right now for, I think, pretty much everyone involved.
When you were talking about the idea of, a lot of the student athletes are getting into the idea of NIL and branding themselves, it took my thoughts to sort of the overall issues we're seeing in sports journalism as a profession and the difficulties that people in your shoes are having. Has sports reporting started to get sidelined by the desire for athletes just to kind of put forward personal brands and messaging rather than the traditional avenues of sports reporting?
I mean, I think yes and no. I think the bigger factor in that is just that the window into which reporters can develop relationships with athletes is a lot narrower. Like, you look back to the days of like Tom DeFord at Sports Illustrated, when he would go around and like spend a week with the team and like travel in their bus. Like, no one does that anymore. Like, I would give an arm and a leg to do that for a story. Like, it would be amazing. But, there's just much more control over the narratives because there's so many more snippets that could get out via social media. And, the athlete having some agency over that by, tweeting and sharing whatever their own message is can be great, because then you kind of get a window into who this person is that you might not get from, the 10-minute press conference. And, I've never had the benefit of working in an environment where it's really just all access, but I do think that that's a big piece of it. I mean, obviously athletes can break their own news, and I think it's kind of cool that they can take it into their own hands and say, you know what, I'm doing this on my own terms, because I think there has been enough times where things get misconstrued and, there's something that goes wrong that an athlete doesn't like how things are positioned and they want to tell it in their own words. And, they're people, more power to them. But I mean, I don't know if I have that much of personal strong opinions on that, but I do think that the bigger thing is the ways in which that we are able to get a window into their life are just much, much smaller now.
How much has sports journalism changed in light of the pandemic? Have we permanently lost some of the access that was there to players and coaches prior to all of the limitations that were placed in 2020?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it. I mean, it's just now getting to the point in certain sports where locker rooms are open again, where, after a game, you could talk to anyone. Because for a while, after a college football game, you'd have the reporters up in the press box and you'd be on a Zoom conference down to the locker room where the coach is talking to you, which just felt ridiculous because, like, we're all at the stadium anyway. And, I get it that there was legitimate health reasons to try to keep, these populations apart. And it made it very, very interesting the way that the stories changed, because if everyone who is at a game is working off of the same 20-minute press conference, you're going to see the same quotes, same material everywhere. And, there's always a degree of that. But I think that it's just, there's so many less stories that are getting told, because sometimes the funniest stories are the ones where, you're asking the offensive lineman, what is your quarterback like when we're not watching? Like, what are they like at school? What are they like in the dining hall? Things like that. And, that O-line player is never going to be the one that's trotted out for the press conference. You're only going to get the quarterback, and the quarterback isn't going to tell you what he's like in study hall and how he goofs off. Like, I don't know. It has been just tougher to get those kind of details. Not impossible, but a little bit more tricky. And I think it's starting to revert back, because I'm hopeful that some of the teams and organizations have realized, this exact thing, and that the stories are better when you can just have more variety. And as people, I guess, get less concerned about some of the health ramifications of COVID. But yeah, it was very, very strange to be reporting in sports for a while, least of which that time for however many months when there weren't even games. Like, that was a wild period. And that was my first like full year on the college football beat, was 2020, which do not recommend in retrospect.
When you're looking at sports journalism now, I know that obviously 2020 is a completely different monster than, being able to report even 5 years ago. But when you're looking at stories now, because I know you've covered stuff with the NHL, you've focused on Olympic sports in the past. What's your method into getting a good, interesting story when you have that limited access now?
Oh, that's a good question. I really like to, this maybe sounds creepy, but a lot of these kids have public social media profiles, and I feel like that's something that a lot of my peers maybe aren't utilizing in the same way. And I like to just look through what they post and see, like, okay, are they a huge dog person? And that's not something that they're going to talk about when they're talking about football. Or just try to find aspects of their personality that are maybe not broadcast from their athletic achievements. But I also find that the people that are going to be easiest to talk to when you're talking about someone that is, maybe now setting records at Alabama is like their high school coach. So someone that knew them back when they were developing, and they're not going to have the same time constraints as, the offensive coordinator at Alabama, who you're never going to be able to talk to. And I find that talking to, old high school teammates and high school coaches is often really, really instructive, and they can often open doors of saying, who else should I talk to? And that is always, I think, a more powerful question than I realized. And oftentimes it can lead you to exactly the right person that you would have never known based on, whatever paper trail they're leaving on the internet. And I think it's really tough to set something apart, but I think the biggest thing is just to write about weird things. And I know that's a luxury that we have at the Journal, and that, we don't have to be as tied to one team or, one topic. Like last year, I wrote a story on Mississippi State's punter that his nickname is Archer because he literally almost made the Olympic team in archery before he decided to try punting. And he's like also a world-class catamaran sailor, and his family has traveled all over the world. I mean, just fascinating guy, but, unless you're a Mississippi State beat reporter, you're probably not writing about a punter who is, a one-year transfer into the SEC and has no track record. So I think just looking for kind of funny details and really just going deep on them. And that can sometimes yield some kind of good stuff.
That brings up an interesting question. How much of writing, what's it like writing to the Wall Street Journal audience as a sports reporter? I mean, how do you frame stories to that audience? And is there kind of an internal strategy and direction? Because it's fascinating to see it at an older newspaper, at a more, staid paper where historically there's been that kind of tension where sports is the toy department. And, and especially at the Wall Street Journal being such a respected financial publication. Talk more about, God, sorry, I hate even to talk about, but I'd love to know a little bit more about that and writing for that audience.
Absolutely. I think, a lot of people, when you tell them that you write for the Wall Street Journal Sports, if they don't read us, they think we're only writing about like the business side. So, if there's like a new naming rights thing or like a transaction or the ownership, and, to our credit, we do write some of those stories, but mostly we just write really zany and weird things because I think, the founding editor of Wall Street Journal Sports, because the section's only been around since I think 2009. So it's relatively new in the, grand scope of sports coverage. But Sam Walker, the original editor, was really insistent on just finding this niche that doesn't exist in the current coverage, in that, your breaking news, Woj bomb updates, you're going to go to somewhere like ESPN or your local beat writers for that. And if you really want to deep dive on a team, you're maybe going to go to your local paper or somewhere like The Athletic. But like, if you want just kind of a fun story, but maybe one that's like a 10,000 foot trend story on like one of the things that my colleague Ben Cohen, who's no longer writing for sports actually now, is a really fascinating column, but when he was writing about basketball for the Journal, he wrote a story and like why the reason why James Harden is so good at step back threes is that he's so good at stopping and redirecting his movement, because that's something that they found out from this one like super nerdy player lab data collection like workout place. I'm not describing this well, but he went to somewhere in the off season and they measured what makes him special, and that was something where they found out he's in like the 99th percentile in. And he learned to exploit that in his game. And the next season, he had so much more of his offense come from that kind of move. So that's a story that, like, maybe if you're a Rockets writer, you would write. But for the most part, it's so in the weeds about this one tiny thing that it's not something that other people would grasp on. So I think, Ben is someone that told me this, but great stories are often ones that make really big trends small, or ones that make really small things huge. And that's something I try to think about often when looking at stories of, like, okay, the year that Joe Burrow was just on a tear on his Heisman campaign at LSU, he made some comment late in the season about, yeah, like, I just wanted to wave to everyone on senior night because, like, I never see the students. And I was like, what the heck does that mean? Like, you go to LSU, how do you not see the students? So then at the SEC championship, I just asked all of his teammates, I was like, so he takes all his classes online. Like, does he ever walk around campus? Like, do people stop and ask for autographs? And they're like, no, he never leaves his apartment. He just plays video games. And I was like, okay, that's kind of hilarious. And, that's not really a breaking news sports story, but we turned it into something that, was revealing about what it means to be, a grad transfer student that is really famous on a campus where you're a celebrity. And, there's kind of, I think when it's, data dives, it's just, I try to think of, like, I'm obviously not an expert, like, coming up with stories is easily the hardest part of this job, but I think just trying to think of ways that we're doing something that no one else would think to do, or that, like, no one else would really have a place to do, is what usually makes a Wall Street Journal sports story great.
Laine, I know we're pretty tight on time from what you had set aside for us.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep chatting a little longer if you want. I'm feeling fired up. We're good. I usually go to bed around this time.
All right, we appreciate it. So on that topic then, do you think it actually kind of helps out with, the mental aspect of being a journalist, the fact that you have, kind of an open field in terms of the stories that you want to do? You can follow these zany threads if you kind of just get a little bit of a whim that, oh, hey, this is kind of an interesting idea, and you're not pigeonholed into having to cover breaking news or these big national trend lines.
Definitely. And, like, I think it works both ways, because there's been times when I know I'm going into a game and I'm going to ask a person a question that's, like, so out of left field that if it's in a press conference, people would, like, turn around and be like, what the heck? And, I'm there to do a job just like they are, but it's such a different mandate that, both sometimes that elicits something really delightful out of the athlete, and other times it feels like you have this complete imposter syndrome because you're not, cramming on deadline after a game like everyone else is that's in the room. So it's good, but there's also, it's like, I think this is actually a political science thing, but, the tyranny of choice, where when you can write about anything, it can be kind of overwhelming to narrow in on, okay, what one thing am I actually going to focus on? Because on any given week, realistically, we could write a story about during football season, about any one of the 130 FBS teams, or if there's a very interesting FCS team. So knowing how to narrow it down and pick your shots to not make it overwhelming was definitely a learned skill. But yeah, it is, the freedom that you get in this job is very, very unique.
I wanted to ask, I know you did back in May you had an interview with NCAA's outgoing president, Mark Emmert, about the direction of his, tenure in college sports. What sense did you get from him, or what were his thoughts on how his tenure went, and how valid did they seem in light of what's been going on?
It seemed, I won't pretend that I know the workings of the NCAA structure and how hard it is to make sweeping changes. So I will give him that credit in that it must be a lot harder than it looks, because he seemed just, a lot of his responses seemed just kind of out of touch, in the sense that, when he was talking about how the NCAA handled the gender equity review that came in the wake of the bubbled NCAA basketball tournaments, where there was, very, very dramatic differences between the resources given to the men and the women. And, a lot of the reporting actually by some of my colleagues and myself kind of helped spur some of that change. He said that it was adequate, and that, they're looking into it and they're doing a great job. And, credit to the NCAA for hiring a firm and looking at it and making some, changes this year. They did do that, but it's still, pretty apparent that there's a long way to go. And I think fessing up and really taking ownership for some of the ways that there was NCAA pitfalls was something that he did not do. And that was a bit, I mean, I don't know if that's his persona, but I think that is definitely a different sort of leadership style that maybe has been missing from college sports. And, he sort of defended the NCAA's strategy of constantly litigating things and, taking things to the Supreme Court and fighting tooth and nail over them. And that didn't seem to trouble him. And it's just surprising because I don't know if the NCAA president could really just wave their hand and say, yes, we're changing this. It's going to be this going forward, because there is a governance structure. There are committees and, methods for change to happen, but it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of that happening. And it didn't seem like Emmert was really one that thought he needed to have ever done that. And yeah, I guess it was both surprising given that some of it seems so obvious to like an outsider looking at the NCAA of seeing like, well, that's a place that there was a mistake and that's another. But it also wasn't that surprising given a lot of the problems that are currently facing college sports.
Do you think the NCAA can really handle the growing change that are happening, especially in FBS football with, NIL, the transfer portal, all of these things? Or is that push for an alternative seemingly a better option for those programs and those teams?
I mean, I do think that designating more rulemaking ability to the individual divisions would be good. It might be worth splitting D1 further. It's currently kind of has that FBS, FCS structure, but it's really still just D1. But I think kind of there is a huge gap within that and a huge variety that is less present in, the D2 and D3 rank. I think maybe trying to make that a little more granular could possibly be interesting. And, because of Alston, the NCAA is very wary about issuing these kind of, association-wide mandates. And I do wonder if there was maybe a little bit less of that hesitation, if there would be more solutions, or, it's possible that because of that, the NCAA will end up pushing a lot more enforcement and decision-making authority into the hands of maybe the conferences or the A5 and the rest and the divisions. But I do think that this whole notion that Congress is going to bail them out on NIL is curious that they are sticking to that so strongly, given that we're now going on year 3 of them advocating for Congress and not much concrete happening. Just because, that's a very busy organization that has a lot else on their plate other than college athletics. And, this is an organization, the NCAA, that's sole mandate is college athletics. I don't know if that really answered the question, but yeah, I think it really depends on 2 things: who the new leader is and what their style is, and how the structure of the NCAA transforms. Obviously, there's a transformation committee that's ongoing right now. We don't know the results of that yet. If it's just kind of putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, yeah, it's probably not going to be something that the NCAA can fix. But if it actually is some dramatic change, I am optimistic that, maybe they can get it done.
Well, Laine, I really appreciate the time you've given us tonight to talk about all of these issues. Because, again, as you said, you get a real broad beat of whatever you really want to cover in college sports and NHL and Olympic and whatever else tickles the fancy of, that seems to be an interesting story. So this was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I know JD and Sirius did too. So for those of you out there who haven't had a chance, I do recommend following Laine on Twitter. I mean, you can follow her just now. Her avatar is right up here. You can click on it and get that information. But appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. And thanks for staying up past your normal bedtime.
I know I'm a bit of a grandma these days, but thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciated it. And it's always fun to talk shop.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you out there who were listening. This was our CFB Talk 53. Laine Higgins from the Wall Street Journal was our guest. On behalf of myself, Bob Kayeri, on behalf of JD, on behalf of Sirius, thank you for joining us. Have a great night. Now I'm going to hang up and